Hey, good morning. It's Captain Roger from the Grass Valley Corps of the Salvation Army here in beautiful Nevada County, California. Thank you so much for joining us for our online worship and study time. Grace and peace to each and every one of you. Hey, you know what we are doing today? We are nearing the end of the book of Acts. We have been able to celebrate our way through Luke's telling of the story of the Holy Spirit-inspired movement of the followers of the way of Jesus during the first 30 or so years after the resurrection. Now, we've got to a point where things seem a little upside down for the current lead character in Luke's tale. Decades of preaching success and spreading the gospel hit a new level of opposition in Jerusalem when Paul the Apostle went back for a visit. He seemed to be expecting to be hailed as kind of a hero, but he quickly found that the politics of the city had changed in his absence. Divisions ran deep, and the anger and fear on both sides was working to push them farther apart. Now, working with the leaders in Jerusalem, including James, the brother of Jesus, a plan had been conceived where Paul would make a public set of offerings for himself and for several men who were finishing a strict Jewish vow of holiness. And this, they hoped, would show that the way was about inclusion, not separation from or rejection of the old ways, even if there were new believers who lived differently from the old. Does that sound familiar? I think that's a theme we hear even in modern days, huh? And it was a valiant effort, what Paul and James had put together. I think it was well worth trying, but ultimately it was interrupted by some from the faction opposing Paul and the way. They accused him of preaching against the old ways and against God, and they did so in just the right time and just the right place to start a riot that they hoped would result in his death. But some quick-acting Roman soldiers intervened, and Paul ended up in Roman custody, where the citizenship and status that he had through his family protected him and gave him rights that his accusers hadn't anticipated. And this led to a series of, for simplicity's sake, we'll call them trials, where Paul has been able to speak about Jesus and the hope that everyone could have in the Jewish God that Jesus represented. He was steadfast in his faith, keeping his eyes on the goal of being able to share about Jesus to Caesar himself. And in the end, that's what's scheduled to happen. All that was left was to send Paul to Rome with the next prisoner transport heading that direction. Luke and a few others who were traveling with the apostle would follow along. They'd even travel on the same ships and in the same caravans when they were able to buy passage, which brings us to Acts 27. So if you haven't done so yet, please grab your Bible and flip to Acts chapter 27. We're going to start in verse 1, and we will make our way through this entire chapter. This is a great chapter. I'm going to break away from my notes for just a second, share with you that if this was a Michael Bay movie, this is the final chase scene. It really is. In fact, this entire book is sort of brought to this chapter because this is the high adventure chapter. It's supposed to be getting your pulse racing. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that are driving the tension and the excitement in this story are sort of cultural. But I think that we can still get enough flavor of it that it should be able to, get the old heart pumping a bit for our characters. Acts chapter 27. Hopefully I gave you time to get there. Verses 1 and 2. I'll be reading from the New International Version, 2011 edition today, because that is the one that we have been using on our trip through the book of Acts. Acts 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some of the other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from too early in the day for me to trip over these words. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. All right, y'all remember who this Aristarchus guy is? If you look back a couple of pages to Acts chapter 20, you'll see he was one of the emissaries who came with Paul to Jerusalem. I'm not sure why Luke name checks him and not whoever else is traveling with them, but the way that he is using the word we in this chapter suggests there's probably at least a couple of others along for this ride. Let me point out we can find Aristarchus' name mentioned in two other books. In Philemon, Paul calls him a fellow worker. Oh my goodness. Tripped over my tongue 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Right. In Philemon, Paul calls Aristarchus his fellow worker. And in Colossians, he's called a fellow prisoner. And some think that means that he is with Paul in the contingent of prisoners on this trip rather than with Luke and the other followers of the way who are part of the entourage that's kind of sticking with them. We really have no way of knowing for sure if Aristarchus was part of the prisoners with Paul, although it could very well be that he was arrested with Paul. He would have been one of the guys with Paul as that emissary. He probably wouldn't have left his presence much. Let's go on. Verse 3. In fact, we're going to read all the way through verse 8. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. Oh, dear. You know, I read over all of these and make sure I can pronounce all the names, but every once in a while, they throw so many into a single passage, it's really difficult to get through with, my American tongue. The lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. Verse 8, we moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. All right, I know this passage reads like a bad travelogue. Obviously, I'm struggling with some of the place names just because they're not American, right? We are very cultural in the way we pronounce things. But this passage does tell us some really good stuff. Julius, he is well disposed towards Paul. So he lets him go visit people he knows in port. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't send 1 or 2 soldiers with, but it's still a sign that he is looking on Paul with some level of favor. And the fact that whoever Paul was visiting would have had the responsibility to be a good host and provide food and lodging for Paul and whoever went with him, that probably didn't hurt because it saves the centurion a couple of bucks anyway. The ship they're on, this isn't some kind of a cruise ship with staterooms and the all-you-can-eat buffet up the hall. These are merchant vessels. They're carrying cargo. And they were willing to let a few passengers hop on and find space to stand or sit out of the way while the ship sails for the day. Then they would move up and down the coast in these little hops, just kind of like one port to the next, staying close to the coast. They tried to only sail in daylight and good weather. These little merchant vessels, man, too much could go wrong for them at night travel, and anchoring in a port at the end of each day meant the sailors and any passengers could go ashore for food and sometimes for a bed to sleep in instead of just having a blanket on the deck. Luke's description tells us that they were on one or more of these little trade ships, and then they switched to a larger grain vessel. I mean, wheat and other food was loaded on in Alexandria onto these larger ships, and then they were moved along this popular trade route to Rome. And these ships, they were not just larger, they were more seaworthy. Sometimes they would even go a few days between ports. The empire had this chronic food shortage, and the emperors worked really hard to keep trade like this flowing steadily into the capital city. Well-fed people rarely rise up against their overlords. Even on the larger ship, though, Luke makes it clear that the weather is working against them, making travel slow and dangerous and diverting them from the easier path. Days, possibly weeks behind schedule, they finally reach this small port on the south side of Crete called Fair Havens. And here they realize they have a problem and they need to make a plan. Look at verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. All right, the Day of Atonement was passed. So what? It's a pagan ship and a pagan crew. Why would it matter that a Jewish holiday had come and gone? Well, it's because it's not actually the holiday that's in view here. It's the date the holiday falls on. It moves around on our calendar, the Day of Atonement, because the Jewish calendar is based on lunar cycles. But it was a fall holiday, September, October, somewhere thereabouts. Presuming that the year we're talking about was the year 59, which it probably was, the Day of Atonement fell on what our calendar would call October 5th. But Luke says that it was past already. So let's say that puts our people out to about October 29th. Oh, that's too far. How about October 19th? All right, October 19th. Now, there's some pretty strict rules for sailing back in these days. One was that you should not sail any time later than September 14th because it was too dangerous. Larger vessels could sometimes go longer, and many did. Claudius, the emperor, he was so desperate to keep grain flowing into Rome that he paid a bounty to any ship that came during the danger season. Plus, he promised he'd cover the cost of any loss right up to the winter sailing cutoff, which was, again, our calendar, November 11th. As of that day, it was considered certain death to set out until after the winter. And Nero continued this policy through his reign. Nero followed Claudius, remember? And Nero was the emperor that Paul was being sent to plead his case before. Now, Paul is certain that making this journey at this time of year, given the poor conditions they had already encountered, was certain to lead to disaster. The man had been traveling his whole life, so his opinion probably would have carried some weight. But remember, he's a prisoner, and both the captain and the owner of the ship thought they could make it, and the duty of the centurion was to deliver the prisoners as quickly as possible. Besides, the Alexandrian ship was too large to winter inside the safety of Fair Haven's Bay. And Fair Haven, even though it was a good anchorage, it was a full 5 miles to the nearest town that could help supply them, so they would be eating their own cargo if they stayed. Sailing into the teeth of the early winter might be tough going, but staying was going to cost them money, and there would be no bonuses if they arrived in the spring. So they sailed. Verse 13, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. Now remember, Luke wrote this in Greek, which is a broader language than English, but he's using some very specific terms for this storm. He's talking about there being a typhoon inside of a northeaster, two utterly terrifying storm conditions that would leave most ships helpless and spinning by themselves. But they are one storm on top of the other here. There is no escape for them once they're caught in the crux. A sleek, modern-equipped hull might be able to try to tack into the wind or to steer into the waves rather than being roiled and tossed jarringly around, but all they would have been able to do is try to keep the ship from being beat to pieces by the waves as it lifts and slams down, and anything not lashed securely to the deck would have scattered about and banged about and beaten on the wood of the hull of the ship. 16. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the soundbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. Now, sometimes when you're out in a storm and you're sailing, you get an island or a spit of land that ends up between you and the wind, and you always hope that that's going to provide some calm. You could try to pull your ship into a protected position, but not this time. The chop was so bad that the lifeboat, which was towed alongside, couldn't be controlled. It had to be pulled up and lashed to the deck to keep it from being wrecked or crashing into the main boat hard enough to damage the hull. and they gave up any real control at that point. They threw out sea anchors in hopes that it would slow them down or cause the ship to turn so they would run with the storm instead of skewing around in it. And they tie lines around the boat to help keep it from falling apart. They're constantly being lifted up and slammed back down. Tying ropes around like that, it's called frapping, which is kind of a cute name for something that you only do if there was certain death about to ring your doorbell. It also sounds funny that they were worried about running aground in Syrtis. That was over 400 miles away. It tells you how out of control they felt at this point. And the fury of the storm continued unabated. You got to put yourself in this situation. Imagine it's dark. Imagine the lashing rain, the lightning, the waves throwing you back and forth, crashing over the top of the ship that you're on. Verses 18 through 20 says, "We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved." As if he ran out of words to describe the constant, unrelenting howling of the wind and rain, Luke gives us the barest sketch of these few days of their watery imprisonment. They're at risk of being swamped or rolled constantly, so they dumped some of the cargo to try to lighten the ship, and the next day they got rid of the gear that wasn't doing them any good. And for many days they had no way to make any readings for locations based on the stars. And they weren't just adrift and at mercy at the storm, they are utterly lost at sea in the tempest. Time and place cease to have meaning when you have no sun, no stars, no daylight, no land, no point of reference for where or even when you might be. And in the crash and toss, there's no way to sit, there's no way to stand, there's no way to eat even. Verse 21 and 22, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed." Oh, in a box of terror, Paul is trying to speak a little calm into their spirits. Don't worry, only the ship that's keeping you alive is going to be destroyed. You'll be fine. That's not exactly what he's saying. He goes on, verses 23 through 26. "Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" Then he turns back to him and he says, "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." All right, so, well, is that reassuring or has he gone mad? You know, sometimes a peaceful voice in the midst of chaos helps make the chaos more bearable. He's not above pointing out that what he said earlier on this trip about it being a disaster certainly seems prophetic. This is as close as we're going to get from Paul to an "I told you so." But he says, you know what? You should have trusted me in that. You should trust me in this too, right? Even the most troubled soul can be given hope. And this is a group that needs some hope. I'm sure that every one of the people on this ship remembered Paul's words and told themselves that even if the ship was lost and they ran aground, that Paul said his God promised they would be saved, right? Verse 27, "On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found that it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight." Again, like with the sea anchor that they threw out before, these anchors are not meant to stop the vessel. They are to slow it, and maybe, if they do get close to land, point them towards it so that the bow will drive itself into the shore rather than the ship getting turned sideways and being destroyed by waves within sight of salvation. Hopefully within sight. The storm hasn't let up enough for them to see if there even is land. Verse 30. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. And then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Some are all the sailors. They decide, we're going to take our own chance. We think we're close enough to land that we could reach it in the lifeboat. But they're certain if they stay on the boat, they're going to get killed, drowned along with the rest. So they contrive this little story about needing to set more anchors. They start to lower the lifeboat. But the only hope for anyone on board is that the ship be run aground. But that is not easy to do, even if you know what you're doing. Paul points this out to the centurion and his men, and they help launch the lifeboat in a more permanent way. Yeah, now everyone here, they're all in this together. Verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and he gave thanks to God in front of them all. And then he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged, and they ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Paul's confidence must have had some effect on him. If he was willing to eat with the expectation of being rescued from this floating coffin, so were the rest of them. And they ate all they could, and then they dumped the rest. To run a ship aground, it needs to be as empty as possible if you want to make it safely, or relatively safely. And as they finished doing that, as they finished dumping the last of their cargo into the sea, the sky began to lighten. Not much, perhaps, but enough to see what they had hoped to see: land. Verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, and they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. This is it. The ship is pointed towards the beach. The anchors are cut away. They haul up a sail to get this baby moving towards the beach. If they can hit it straight on, they will be able to hop off onto land. Everyone is on deck. They're all watching as the ship accelerates towards the safety of the sand ahead. Verse 41, but the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. It only takes a second for everything to go wrong. With a lurch, the ship's forward motion stops. Something cracks beneath them as they scrape over the sandbar that's protecting the bay. And then the storm waves hitting the rear of the ship begin to just literally shred the wood, breaking it, peeling it away from the wreck that the ship is quickly becoming. It seems like their last chance has failed. Verse 42, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. They weren't even sure that survival was possible, but the duty of a Roman soldier was to keep his prisoner, and failure to complete that duty often meant death. Better to kill them than to take the chance of letting them go. Verses 43 and 44, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Do you know how improbable that is? About 4 years after this, Josephus, the Jewish historian, he was on an even larger ship sailing on a very similar route. They got caught in a storm. They ran aground and they tried to swim. Of 600 men on that ship, only 80 were able to get clear and swim free to survive. But on Paul's ship, every one of the 274 souls on board regrouped on the beach alive. They'd been driven more than 475 miles through a constant storm during just over 2 weeks of chaos and fear. Professor Ben Witherington says that God's providence overruled natural circumstances which should have left most or all of the people on this ship dead. When Paul says to them, "My God tells me this thing is true," do you think they might listen? Now, we'll find out where they are and what happens next when we gather together again. But for today, I want to point out one main thing, and I want you to leave with one idea firmly planted in your mind. Know that we can trust the promises of our God. Even when life around us is chaos and what appears to be our only safe place is being torn apart beneath us, we can trust God. And the idea that should grow from that to take root in your soul is simply this: when you trust in God, you can have peace in any storm. As soon as Paul had that visit telling him not to worry, he chose to believe God's message, and he chose not to worry. And he encouraged the others around him. He got them to take a moment to breathe a little easier, to eat and prepare to go on with life, even when it looked like that wasn't going to be an option for them. Trust God to keep his promises and find peace in that trust. Amen? So, whoever you are, wherever you go, remember, you have nothing to fear, for God is with you. From the highest of heavens to the deepest of the depths, he is there. Turn to God, trust in God, be at peace in God, and go with God. Grace and peace to each and every one of you today. See you next time.